Rain hammered the steel roof of the military tribunal as thousands gathered outside the fortress-like courthouse waving signs that read "Traitor and Execute Kane," while giant screens mounted above the plaza replayed the same footage again and again: the burning skyline of Port Aldder, the collapse of the eastern defense wall, and finally the image that had poisoned an entire nation against one man, Commander Jason Kane, walking away from the battlefield while 600 soldiers were left trapped behind enemy lines. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere carried none of the chaos from outside. It was cold, polished, almost ceremonial. Armed guards lined the walls with rifles pressed against their armored chests while reporters whispered into microphones from enclosed media booths. At the center of the chamber sat Jason Kane himself, wrists chained to the steel table before him, his dark prison uniform contrasting sharply against the silver military insignia carved into the floor beneath the tribunal platform. He looked older than his 40 years. Not weak, not broken, but exhausted in a way that sleep could never repair. A scar ran from beneath his left eye down toward his jawline, pale against his weathered skin. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the cameras. His eyes remained fixed on the glass wall at the far end of the room where rain streamed down like endless tears. "Commander Jason Kane," announced High Justice Miriam Vale, her voice amplified through hidden speakers, "you stand accused of treason against the Republic, conspiracy with enemy forces, desertion during wartime, and the murder of military personnel through intentional abandonment. How do you plead?" Jason slowly lifted his head. "I already told you," he replied quietly. "It won't matter." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Vale narrowed her eyes. "Your plea?" Jason leaned back slightly in his chair. "Not guilty." The room erupted instantly. Shouting exploded from the gallery while reporters scrambled to capture reactions. One voice rose above the others. "You let my brother die." A woman lunged forward from the front row before guards restrained her. Jason looked at her only briefly. No anger. No defense. Just a flicker of pain that vanished almost immediately. Sitting 3 rows behind the woman was Elena Kane, Jason's wife. Or technically still his wife, though she had not spoken to him directly in almost 2 years. Her face remained composed, but her hands trembled against the edge of her seat. Beside her sat Jason's younger brother Marcus, now wearing the decorated black uniform of Republic intelligence. Marcus stared at Jason with open disgust. "Still lying," he muttered. Elena did not answer. On the tribunal platform, Vale raised a hand for silence. Due to the severity of these accusations and public demand for transparency, the court has authorized full neural memory extraction for evidentiary review. A low wave of anticipation spread through the room. Memory extraction technology was rarely used publicly. Too invasive. Too dangerous. Too revealing. But the Republic wanted spectacle. They wanted certainty. Most of all, they wanted to watch their monster finally cornered. 2 technicians entered carrying a metallic crown lined with glowing neural pins. Jason's expression did not change when they positioned it over his head. Vale folded her hands. "These memories will determine whether history remembers you as a war criminal or a martyr." Jason gave a humorless laugh. "History already decided." The chamber lights dimmed. The massive screen behind the tribunal flickered to life. A technician spoke from the control deck. "Beginning extraction from memory cluster 42. Date, 6 days before the fall of Port Aldder." The screen brightened, and suddenly the courtroom vanished into another world. The memory opened on a crowded refugee camp buried beneath snowstorms near the northern border. Children huddled around broken heaters while exhausted medics stitched wounds inside. Canvas tents. The younger Jason Kane moved through the camp carrying supply crates on his shoulders despite blood soaking through a bandage around his ribs. "Commander," a medic warned, "you're reopening the wound." "Then stitch it again later," Jason answered. He stopped beside a small girl crying beside a frozen water barrel. "Where's your family?" The girl pointed weakly toward the medical tents. Jason entered immediately. Inside, rows of injured civilians filled every inch of space. He located the girl's mother barely conscious from infection. Without hesitation, Jason removed his own insulated combat coat and draped it over the woman before kneeling beside a medic. "How long until antibiotics arrive?" "Tomorrow maybe. She won't last tonight." The medic looked away helplessly. Jason stood silently for several seconds, then removed a sealed injector from his own emergency kit. "Commander," the medic protested, "that's your anti-radiation dose. She needs it more." He handed it over without another word. In the courtroom, whispers spread uneasily. Marcus frowned. "That doesn't prove anything." But the memories continued. Scene after scene unfolded across the giant screen. Jason carrying civilians through flooded tunnels during the Carthian bombings. Jason disobeying orders to rescue trapped engineers from a collapsing reactor. Jason standing beside terrified recruits during artillery strikes, calming them with dry humor while explosions shook the trenches around them. The tribunal shifted uncomfortably as the image of the ruthless traitor began colliding with something far more complicated. Elena stared at the screen without blinking. She had never seen most of this. Neither had the public. Vale interrupted sharply. "These isolated acts of service do not erase the events at Port Aldder." "No," Jason replied quietly. "They don't." The next memory began immediately. A military command center buzzed with panic. Maps flickered across digital tables while alarms screamed through the corridors. General Adrian Holt stood at the center issuing rapid commands. Younger officers rushed around him like frightened birds. Jason entered still covered in battlefield dust. "We need immediate evacuation of Sector 12, he said. Enemy forces breached the underground rail system. Holt barely looked at him. "Denied. There are civilians trapped down there. The city's already lost." Jason slammed both hands onto the command table. "Then let me go get them." Holt turned cold eyes toward him. "Your job is to secure the western bridge. The bridge won't matter if the rail tunnels collapse." "That's an order, Commander." Silence filled the memory. Jason stared at Holt for a long moment before speaking through clenched teeth. "One day people are going to realize how many bodies you leave behind to protect your reputation." Gasps spread across the courtroom. High Justice Vale leaned forward slightly. "Pause playback." The screen froze. Vale looked toward the prosecution bench where General Holt himself now sat in full ceremonial uniform, silver-haired and perfectly composed. "General," Vale asked carefully, "was this confrontation documented?" Holt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Commander Kane became emotionally unstable during the final weeks of the war. He frequently challenged authority. Jason laughed softly without humor. "That's one way to say it." Vale signaled for playback to continue. The memory shifted again. Night. Rain. Sirens. Jason moved alone through smoke-filled subway tunnels carrying a flashlight and assault rifle. Distant screams echoed ahead. The camera perspective shook with his breathing as he descended deeper underground. Suddenly enemy soldiers appeared through the haze. Gunfire erupted. Jason fired precisely while sprinting toward the trapped civilians. A train car had derailed inside the tunnel, pinning dozens beneath twisted metal. Jason holstered his weapon and began pulling survivors free even as explosions echoed closer. "Move," he shouted. "Follow the lights." One teenager grabbed his arm. "My father's still inside." Without hesitation Jason crawled into the unstable wreckage. The courtroom watched in tense silence as the metal frame shifted dangerously above him. Sparks rained down. Finally Jason emerged carrying an unconscious man across his shoulders moments before the entire tunnel section collapsed behind him in a storm of debris. Elena covered her mouth. She remembered that night. The government had claimed rescue teams saved the civilians. Jason never corrected them. The memories accelerated through months of war. Battles. Sacrifices. Sleepless nights. Jason refusing medals. Jason visiting grieving families personally. Jason secretly paying medical expenses for wounded soldiers using his own military salary. Gradually the courtroom's hatred lost certainty. Confusion replaced it. Reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Even the protesters outside seemed quieter as the live broadcast spread across the city. Then came the memory everyone waited for. Port Aldder. The final battle. Smoke blotted out the sky while artillery fire turned entire districts into burning ruins. Soldiers screamed orders through broken comm systems. Jason sprinted across rooftops alongside his elite unit known as Vanguard 7. Among them were Marcus and Elena before either betrayal or tragedy had shattered them apart. Eastern barricades gone. Marcus shouted over explosions. Enemy armor moving toward the harbor. Jason scanned the chaos below. Thousands of civilians flooded the streets trying to escape bombardment. Where's air support? Withdrawn, Elena answered grimly. High Command pulled them an hour ago. Jason froze. What? They said the city can't be defended. There are still evacuation convoys inside the perimeter. Another explosion rocked the building beneath them. Marcus grabbed Jason's shoulder. We need to retreat now. Jason stared toward the harbor where columns of smoke rose into the sky. No, he said. We hold until the civilians clear. Marcus cursed furiously. That's suicide. Jason looked directly at him. Then leave. The memory fractured into rapid sequences of combat. Vanguard 7 defending intersections against overwhelming forces. Jason dragging wounded soldiers through sniper fire. Elena firing from shattered windows while screaming coordinates into columns. Hours passed. Then came the moment history never explained properly. Inside a ruined command bunker, Jason intercepted a classified transmission. The courtroom listened as static crackled through the speakers. General Holt's voice emerged clearly. Authorize breach protocol. Collapse the eastern defense wall immediately. Another officer sounded horrified. Sir, our own troops are still inside the sector. The enemy advance must be contained. Commander Kane's team hasn't extracted. Holt answered coldly. Acceptable losses. Silence flooded the courtroom. Marcus visibly stiffened. Elena's face drained of color. On screen, Jason replayed the transmission twice, disbelief hardening into fury. Then alarms began screaming. The wall charges had activated. Jason grabbed the comm radio. All units retreat now. The eastern wall's coming down. Static answered him. Enemy jamming blocked the signal. He turned toward his team. Get everyone out. Marcus stared at him. There's no time. Then make time. The memory erupted into chaos. Jason split from the group and raced deeper into the city toward the trapped battalions while the countdown to detonation echoed through emergency speakers. Buildings collapsed around him. Fires spread across entire streets. He reached the abandoned soldiers just as panic consumed them. Fall back, he roared. Move south now. Some obeyed immediately. Others froze in confusion. Jason physically shoved them forward as shockwaves trembled beneath the ground. Meanwhile, Elena and Marcus reached the extraction zone. Soldiers scrambled onto armored transports while explosions devoured the horizon behind them. Marcus searched frantically through the smoke. Where's Jason? No answer came. Then the eastern wall detonated. The screen filled with blinding white light as an entire section of the city collapsed inward, burying soldiers and enemy forces alike beneath mountains of concrete and fire. In the courtroom, nobody spoke. The silence felt suffocating. The official story had always claimed Jason abandoned his men before the collapse. But the memories showed him running toward danger while others escaped. Vale turned slowly toward General Holt. Were these orders disclosed during the original investigation? Holt's expression remained calm but sweat glistened near his collar. Battlefield confusion can distort memory reconstruction. Jason suddenly spoke louder than before. Then keep watching. The next memory opened inside a black-site medical facility 3 days after Port Aldder. Jason lay restrained on an operating table, severely wounded and barely conscious. Men in intelligence uniforms surrounded him. Marcus appeared younger, exhausted, conflicted. He survived, one officer asked. General Holt stepped into view. Unfortunately. Elena's voice echoed from outside the room. I want to see him. Denied, Holt answered immediately. Marcus looked between them uneasily. Sir? If he tells people what happened, Holt interrupted. He won't. A doctor adjusted a neural device above Jason's head. Memory suppression prepared. Elena forced her way into the room then, eyes red from crying. What are you doing to him? Holt approached her carefully. Commander Kane disobeyed orders and caused catastrophic losses. That's not true. You didn't hear the transmission. Elena looked toward unconscious Jason. Then let him testify. Holt's face hardened. The Republic needs unity after the war. Not accusations. Marcus slowly realized the truth. You're blaming him. Holt stepped closer. I'm preserving national stability. Jason struggled weakly against restraints. Marcus, his younger brother, looked horrified but frozen. Holt spoke quietly enough that only the room could hear. If Kane speaks publicly, this country fractures overnight. Millions died because difficult choices had to be made. Elena whispered, you sacrificed them. Holt ignored her. History requires villains. Commander Kane is convenient. In the courtroom, reporters exploded into shouting. The judges hammered for order while outside the courthouse the crowds watching the broadcast began screaming in outrage. Marcus sat completely motionless, his face pale as death. Elena looked at Jason with tears finally breaking free after years of anger. You let me hate you, she whispered. Jason kept his eyes on the floor. It was safer. Vale rose from her seat. This tribunal is temporarily suspended pending verification. No, Jason interrupted firmly. Everyone turned toward him. For the first time all day, there was force in his voice. Play the final memory. Holt immediately stood. That material is classified. Jason looked directly at him. Exactly. The technicians hesitated until Vale gave a tense nod. Proceed. The final memory began in darkness. Jason sat alone inside a prison transport years earlier, bruised and handcuffed, while a hidden communicator crackled beneath his collar. An unfamiliar female voice spoke. If you stay silent, they'll execute you eventually. Jason answered calmly. I know. Then why protect them? Long silence followed before Jason replied. Because if Holt's network gets exposed too early, the Republic collapses into civil war. The woman sounded frustrated. People already think you're a monster. Jason closed his eyes. Better me than millions dead in another war. The memory shifted forward through secret meetings, hidden investigations, encrypted files. Despite imprisonment and public hatred, Jason had spent years quietly dismantling a corruption network inside the Republic government tied to wartime profiteering and illegal weapons sales. Every accusation against him had given him access to places nobody else noticed. Prison transfers. Intelligence hearings. Underground contacts. He had turned himself into bait while his enemies believed him destroyed. Then the memory revealed the final shock. General Holt was not merely covering up Port Aldder. He had orchestrated the entire collapse intentionally to justify emergency wartime powers and secure control over reconstruction contracts worth billions. Entire battalions had been sacrificed for political leverage. As the courtroom absorbed this revelation, armed guards suddenly rushed toward the exits. Chaos erupted outside. One of the tribunal officers shouted into his radio, "We have unauthorized military movement approaching the courthouse." Holt backed away slowly from the prosecution bench. Jason noticed immediately. He's running. Marcus snapped out of his paralysis. "Seal the exits." But the lights abruptly died. Gunshots exploded through the darkness. People screamed. Emergency sirens activated as smoke grenades rolled across the floor. Jason remained seated as armed mercenaries stormed the chamber wearing black tactical gear marked with no insignia. Their leader aimed a rifle toward Holt. "Package secured." Holt shouted furiously, "Get me out now." Elena stared in disbelief. "You hired them?" Another mercenary grabbed Holt's arm. "Move." The tribunal dissolved into panic. Guards exchanged fire with attackers while civilians crawled beneath benches. Marcus rushed toward Elena just as a bullet shattered the glass behind them. Jason looked toward the fallen guard beside him, keys dangling from the man's belt. He could flee. Nobody could stop him in the chaos. Instead he unlocked his chains, grabbed the wounded guard, and dragged him behind cover as bullets tore through the courtroom. Marcus saw it happen and froze for half a second. Jason shouted across the chamber, "Marcus! Get Elena down!" Another explosion blasted open the rear wall. Rain and wind roared into the courtroom as Holt's mercenaries attempted extraction by armored transport. Jason grabbed a fallen rifle and moved with terrifying efficiency despite years in captivity. Every motion was precise. Controlled. Familiar. The hated traitor became a soldier again within seconds. He shot one attacker through the shoulder, flipped a table for cover, then sprinted directly into crossfire to protect trapped civilians still scrambling toward safety. Elena watched him in stunned silence. This was the man she married. The man she buried beneath years of resentment. Jason reached the central aisle and tackled a mercenary before the attacker could execute a tribunal judge. The two men crashed through shattered glass into the rain-soaked exterior balcony overlooking the city thousands of feet below. The mercenary drew a knife. Jason caught the wrist mid-strike and slammed the man against the railing hard enough to crack metal. Gunfire flashed behind them while thunder rolled overhead. Inside the chamber, Marcus finally recovered enough to organize surviving guards. "Push them back," he shouted. "Protect the civilians first." Jason heard the command and almost smiled despite blood running down his temple. Marcus was finally acting like himself again. But then Jason spotted something worse. Holt was escaping through the underground transit tunnel beneath the courthouse. Jason immediately turned and ran after him without a word. Elena saw him disappear into the smoke and followed before anyone could stop her. The underground tunnels beneath the tribunal were old wartime evacuation routes lined with rusted pipes and flickering emergency lights. Water dripped from the ceiling as distant gunfire echoed above. Jason moved quickly despite his injuries, following fresh footprints through the darkness. Elena caught up several corridors later, breathing hard. "Jason." He stopped only briefly. For a moment neither spoke. Years of grief and betrayal stood between them like ghosts. Finally Elena asked the only thing that mattered. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Jason looked away. "Because they were watching you. I would have believed you." "No," he answered quietly. "You would have tried to save me." Another explosion shook dust from the tunnel ceiling. Elena stepped closer. "I hated you." Jason nodded once. "I know. Every day. I know." Her voice cracked. "And you still protected me." Jason stared at her for a long moment before answering. "There was never a version of this where I stopped loving you." Before Elena could respond, distant footsteps echoed ahead. "Holt!" Jason immediately resumed moving. The tunnels eventually opened into an abandoned rail station buried beneath the city. Emergency lights cast long red shadows across rusted train cars. Holt stood near an armored escape vehicle surrounded by remaining mercenaries. When he saw Jason emerge from the darkness, genuine fear finally appeared on his face. "You should have stayed buried," Holt snapped. Jason lowered the rifle slightly. "You said history needed a villain." Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the concrete floor. "Looks like you volunteered." Holt signaled his men forward. Kill him. The gunfight that followed tore through the abandoned station with brutal intensity. Jason moved between pillars and train wreckage while bullets sparked against steel around him. Elena grabbed a fallen weapon and joined the fight without hesitation. They moved instinctively together despite years apart, covering angles, signaling positions, anticipating each other's actions like muscle memory surviving long after trust had died. One mercenary rushed Elena from behind only for Jason to intercept him with a violent tackle across the station platform. Marcus arrived moments later with surviving security forces flooding the tunnels from both entrances. Holt realized the trap closing around him and panicked. He sprinted toward the escape vehicle while firing wildly behind him. Jason pursued immediately. The armored transport accelerated down the old rail tunnel just as Jason leaped onto its rear platform. Holt tried to shake him loose as the vehicle thundered through darkness at terrifying speed. Inside, Holt drew a pistol with trembling hands. "Do you know what happens if the Republic learns everything?" he shouted. "It burns." Jason climbed through shattered rear doors. "Maybe it deserves the truth anyway." Holt fired twice. One bullet grazed Jason's side. The second shattered a control panel. Sparks erupted throughout the vehicle as it lost stability racing along unstable tracks beneath the city. Holt screamed at the driver to maintain speed while Jason fought him hand-to-hand inside the violently shaking transport. Finally the vehicle derailed around a collapsing curve. Metal screamed. The transport flipped end over end through darkness before crashing sideways into a concrete support wall. Silence followed except for dripping fuel and distant sirens. Jason slowly crawled from the wreckage bleeding heavily. Holt lay trapped beneath twisted steel, barely conscious. For several long seconds Jason simply stared at him. Holt coughed weakly. "If you kill me now," he rasped, "they'll call you exactly what they always did." Jason looked toward the shattered tunnel above where faint daylight filtered through cracks in the concrete. Then he stepped forward and pulled the metal debris off Holt instead of leaving him to die. Holt stared in disbelief. "After everything?" Jason answered with exhausted bitterness. "I'm tired of digging graves." Sirens grew louder. Above the city, the storm finally began to break apart as dawn slowly pushed through the clouds. By the time emergency crews reached the wrecked transport tunnel, dawn had fully broken over the Republic capital, washing the city in a pale gray light that made the shattered courthouse above look less like a seat of justice and more like the aftermath of a siege. News drones circled overhead broadcasting every second live across the nation while citizens gathered around screens in cafes, apartment towers, military barracks, and crowded train stations, all watching the same impossible story unfold in real time. Jason Kane, the man condemned as the greatest traitor in Republic history, emerging from underground carrying the very architect of the conspiracy that had destroyed him. Holt drifted in and out of consciousness while paramedics rushed toward them. Security officers raised rifles instinctively at Jason before Marcus stepped between them. "Stand down," he ordered sharply. Some hesitated. Others obeyed immediately. The difference was enough for Jason to notice. Faith in authority was cracking already. Elena reached them seconds later, soaked from rain and streaked with dust and blood. She stopped several feet from Jason as medics pulled Holt onto a stretcher. Neither knew how to begin after years of silence compressed into a single violent night. Finally Elena asked softly, "Are you hurt?" Jason glanced at the blood soaking through his side. "Nothing dramatic." "You were shot." "I've had worse mornings." She almost laughed despite herself, and the tiny sound seemed to surprise both of them. Before either could say more, military transports descended onto the avenue surrounding the courthouse. Heavily armed soldiers flooded the streets. Citizens nearby backed away nervously as armored vehicles sealed intersections. Marcus watched the deployment with immediate suspicion. That response came too fast. Jason followed his gaze toward the black transport at the center of the convoy. Because they were waiting. The rear doors opened. Minister Roland Voss stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed government coat untouched by the storm. He was older than Holt, thinner, with calm silver eyes that revealed almost nothing. Unlike Holt, Voss rarely appeared publicly despite technically holding more power than half the Republic Senate combined. Jason's expression darkened instantly. Elena noticed. You know him. He built the network, Jason answered quietly. Marcus frowned. Holt worked for Voss? Holt was the soldier, Jason said. Voss is the reason the war never really ended. Voss approached slowly through the sea of cameras and soldiers. Commander Kane, he said smoothly. Quite a performance. Marcus stepped forward. Minister Voss, General Holt is under arrest for war crimes and conspiracy against the Republic. Voss smiled faintly. Of course he is. His eyes shifted toward Jason. Though I suspect Commander Kane understands how complicated these matters truly are. Jason's hand tightened at his side. You sacrificed entire cities. I preserved a nation. Voss spoke so calmly that several nearby reporters fell silent trying to capture every word. Peace is not maintained through ideals, Commander. It survives through fear, leverage, and carefully managed enemies. Elena stared at him in disgust. People died. Millions survived. Voss looked toward the skyline where reconstruction towers gleamed in the distance. History remembers outcomes, not methods. Jason stepped closer despite the rifles surrounding them. Then maybe history needs better memory. For the first time Voss's composure thinned slightly. You think exposing corruption fixes the Republic? The moment these broadcasts finish spreading, markets crash, alliances fracture, military districts turn against each other. Every hostile nation beyond our borders will smell weakness. Maybe, Jason answered. But at least people will finally know who buried their children. Silence stretched between them before Voss gave a disappointed sigh. You always were difficult to control. Suddenly explosions thundered several blocks away. Screams erupted through the avenue as smoke rose from a nearby government communications tower. Soldiers scrambled into defensive positions while civilians fled in panic. Marcus swore under his breath. What now? Jason's expression hardened instantly. Diversion. Almost on cue, every screen broadcasting the tribunal abruptly went black. Emergency alerts replaced the footage. National security threat. Unauthorized insurrection activity. Remain indoors. Voss calmly adjusted his gloves while chaos spread around him. You see, he said quietly to Jason. Truth creates panic faster than lies ever did. Then he turned toward his transport. Jason moved immediately, but armed soldiers blocked his path. Marcus grabbed one rifle aside. Don't let him leave. The soldiers hesitated, trapped between conflicting commands. Voss used the confusion perfectly. His convoy accelerated away from the courthouse while distant gunfire echoed through the city center. Marcus looked toward Jason. Tell me you have a plan. Jason stared after the disappearing convoy for several seconds. I have pieces of one. That's not reassuring. It never was. Within an hour the capital descended into controlled chaos. Government channels insisted extremist groups had manipulated the tribunal broadcast while independent media released fragments of the exposed memories faster than censors could contain them. Protests exploded across multiple districts. Some demanded executions for everyone involved in Port Aldder. Others accused the broadcast itself of being fabricated enemy propaganda. Nobody knew what to trust anymore. Jason, Elena, and Marcus relocated to an abandoned intelligence safehouse hidden beneath an old textile factory on the industrial outskirts of the city. Dust covered most of the equipment, but emergency generators still powered the underground rooms. Marcus paced furiously near the central monitor station while Elena treated Jason's gunshot wound at a metal table nearby. You should have gone to a hospital, she muttered while stitching the injury. Jason winced slightly. Hospitals are easy to find. Hold still. You always stab harder when you're angry. Elena tied off the bandage sharply. Maybe because you disappear for 2 years and return during a national collapse.
A faint smile touched Jason's face before fading again.
Across the room, Marcus slammed both hands against a console.
I don't understand any of this.
He turned toward Jason with visible frustration.
Why keep investigating alone? Why not expose Voss years ago? Jason pulled his shirt back over the bandage. Because I didn't have proof strong enough to survive political spin.
Marcus gestured toward the screens displaying riots across the capital.
And this is better? Jason looked genuinely tired for the first time since the tribunal. No.
This is just later. Marcus opened his mouth to argue again before stopping abruptly.
Guilt finally overtook his anger.
I testified against you, he said quietly.
Jason met his eyes. I know.
I called you a traitor on national broadcasts.
I know.
Marcus stared at the floor.
Part of me believed you abandoned us. Jason leaned back against the table. I abandoned the mission. Marcus looked confused.
Jason continued softly, the mission stopped being about protecting people a long time before Port Aldder.
Most of us just didn't realize it yet.
Silence settled heavily through the room.
Elena finally spoke without looking up from the medical supplies. What happens now? Jason walked toward the dusty map wall at the center of the safe house.
Several old locations remained pinned across it with coded markings. He pointed toward a mountainous region near the eastern border. Voss has a private archive facility here.
Marcus frowned. What's inside?
Everything. Jason's voice turned grim.
Financial records. Assassination orders. Military blackmail files.
Evidence against senators, generals, foreign diplomats.
Enough to collapse half the government permanently. Elena crossed her arms. Then why hasn't he destroyed it already?
Jason looked toward her.
Because men like Voss never believe they'll lose.
Before anyone could respond, one of the monitors flickered unexpectedly. A woman's face appeared through static.
Dark hair.
Sharp features.
One artificial eye glowing faint blue beneath dim lighting.
You're all over the news, she said dryly. Marcus immediately drew his pistol.
Who are you?
Someone who kept your brother alive longer than your government managed.
Jason stepped toward the screen. Mira. Elena looked between them carefully. You know her too? Mira ignored the question. Voss activated containment teams across 3 sectors. They're hunting everyone connected to the tribunal. How long until they trace this location? Jason asked. Hours, maybe less. Myra's mechanical eye adjusted focus toward Elena and Marcus. So unless you enjoy dying in abandoned factories, I suggest moving.
Marcus narrowed his eyes.
Why help us? Mira gave a humorless smile. Because Voss killed my family before he ruined yours.
The transmission shifted, revealing armed figures moving behind her in a dim operations room.
I have transportation ready. Eastern Freight District. Platform 19. 1 hour. The screen went dark.
Marcus immediately objected.
This could be a trap.
It could, Jason agreed.
You trust her? Elena asked.
Jason hesitated only slightly.
With some things. Elena noticed the hesitation more than the answer itself.
An hour later they moved through the lower districts disguised beneath civilian coats while unrest spread across the city above them. Fires burned in several neighborhoods. Military checkpoints blocked major intersections.
Crowds argued with armed patrols beneath giant public screens still repeating fragmented tribunal footage.
Jason walked slightly ahead of the others through crowded alleyways with the instincts of someone who never truly stopped living in danger.
Elena studied him quietly as they moved.
Prison and betrayal had changed him physically, but what unsettled her most was the absence of bitterness. She had expected anger after everything. Instead, there was only exhaustion layered over relentless purpose.
At one intersection, a frightened young man recognized Jason from the broadcasts.
The teenager froze, holding a grocery bag against his chest.
Commander Kane? Nearby pedestrians turned nervously. Marcus tensed instantly. Jason simply looked at the boy.
The teenager swallowed hard.
My father was at Port Aldder. Silence hung between them. Elena prepared herself for accusation. Instead, the boy's voice broke unexpectedly. He came home because of you. Jason seemed caught off guard.
The boy continued quietly. He said you carried wounded soldiers through the collapse after everyone else retreated. Tears filled his eyes.
Thank you.
Before Jason could respond, the teenager hurried away into the crowd.
Elena watched Jason carefully.
For several seconds he looked more shaken by gratitude than he ever had by hatred. They reached the freight district shortly before sunset. Rusted train platforms stretched endlessly beneath industrial floodlights while cargo drones buzzed overhead. Platform 19 appeared abandoned except for a single black locomotive humming quietly on inactive rails. Armed figures emerged from the shadows as they approached. Marcus reached for his weapon until Jason raised a hand slightly.
Mira stepped into view wearing tactical armor beneath a long dark coat. The artificial eye gave her expression a permanently intense focus. You're late, she said. City checkpoints slowed us down, Jason answered. Mira looked him over briefly. You look terrible. You always say that. Because it's usually true. Elena crossed her arms immediately. You flirt with everyone during national emergencies? Mira finally looked at her directly and smirked faintly. Only ex-war heroes with death sentences. Jason sighed. Can we survive the evening before this gets worse? Unlikely. Mira gestured toward the locomotive. Get aboard.
Inside, the train had been converted into a mobile operations center filled with weapons crates, surveillance equipment, and armed operatives monitoring live government transmissions.
Marcus looked around uneasily. Who are these people? Mira removed her gloves. Former intelligence officers. Whistleblowers.
Soldiers abandoned by the Republic after inconvenient missions.
People Voss thought disappeared. One older operative glanced toward Jason with respect. Didn't think we'd ever see you out of chains, Commander. Jason gave a tired nod.
The train began moving moments later, carrying them east through industrial tunnels beneath the capital. Rain tapped softly against the armored windows while tension settled through the cabin.
Elena eventually found Jason alone near the rear observation compartment watching city lights fade into darkness.
You disappeared from my life, she said quietly.
But somehow you were never really gone, were you?
Jason kept his eyes on the passing tunnels.
I checked on you. I know.
He looked surprised. Elena leaned against the wall beside him.
The flowers outside my mother's grave every winter. The anonymous money when my clinic almost closed.
The man who stopped following me after I reported being watched.
Jason exhaled slowly. I couldn't let them use you against me. So instead you let me mourn someone still alive.
Her voice held no anger now.
Only sadness. Jason finally looked at her directly. You deserved a peaceful life. Elena laughed softly at the absurdity. Jason, I married you during a war.
For the first time in years they stood close without bitterness poisoning the space between them.
Jason reached toward her instinctively, then stopped himself halfway. Elena noticed. You don't have to keep acting like you're already gone. Before he could answer, alarms suddenly blared through the train. Myra's voice echoed through the intercom. Incoming drones. Everyone brace. The train shook violently as explosions erupted outside. Jason immediately sprinted toward the operations car. Surveillance screen showed attack drones descending through the mountain pass behind them, firing missiles into the tracks. Marcus cursed. How did they find us?
Mira reloaded a rifle smoothly.
Voss has more resources than paranoia. Another explosion rocked the train hard enough to throw operatives sideways.
One cargo car derailed behind them in a shower of sparks.
Jason grabbed the communication mic. Emergency. Decoupling now. The rear sections detached seconds before missile strikes obliterated them across the tracks. But more drones kept coming. Tunnel ahead, an engineer shouted. Too narrow for evasive maneuvers. Jason studied the tactical display rapidly. Mira, can your people hold them for 90 seconds? She checked her weapon. Probably not. Good enough.
He turned toward Marcus. There's an old maintenance shaft intersecting this tunnel 3 kilometers ahead.
Marcus blinked. How do you know that?
I helped build half these wartime routes.
Jason pointed toward the engineers. Kill the train lights once we enter the tunnel. Make them think we lost power. Myra's eye narrowed. And then?
Jason loaded a rifle from the weapons rack. Then we make the drones chase the wrong target. The train thundered into darkness as explosions closed in behind them and the tunnel walls began shaking from incoming fire. The moment the train plunged into the mountain tunnel, every light inside the cars died simultaneously, leaving only dim emergency strips glowing red along the floor while the roar of engines echoed through the darkness like distant thunder. Operatives scrambled into position beside reinforced windows as the first attack drones entered the tunnel behind them, their searchlights slicing through smoke and debris. Jason moved calmly through the chaos, checking ammunition with the cold efficiency of someone who had survived too many impossible situations to panic now. Marcus, he said over the noise, maintenance hatch.
Should be 50 meters ahead on the left wall.
Marcus peered through the narrow observation slit.
I can barely see anything.
You'll see sparks from the rail switch.
Right on cue, bright flashes erupted ahead where damaged tracks crossed the tunnel floor.
Jason grabbed a lever near the cabin door and yanked it downward. Hidden side panels along the train opened instantly, ejecting several cargo containers onto the rails behind them. The drones opened fire immediately, shredding the containers in violent explosions that filled the tunnel with fire and black smoke.
Now! Jason shouted.
The engineer slammed emergency brakes while Marcus triggered the maintenance switch.
A concealed rail junction shifted beneath the train with a deafening metallic scream.
The locomotive veered sharply into a narrow side passage barely wide enough to contain it while the attack drones continued racing forward through the smoke, unaware the train had disappeared onto another track. Seconds later, massive explosions thundered through the main tunnel as the drones collided with the destroyed cargo cars at full speed. The shockwave rattled the entire mountain.
Dust poured from the tunnel ceiling while alarms screamed throughout the train. Several operatives cheered in relief, but Jason did not. He kept watching the tactical monitor. Mira noticed immediately. What? Jason pointed toward a blinking signal.
One drone survived. Before anyone could react, the remaining attack drone burst through the smoke behind them, firing directly into the rear train car.
Metal exploded inward. Operatives were thrown across the compartment as flames spread through equipment racks.
Marcus hit the floor hard while Elena grabbed onto a railing to keep from being hurled sideways.
Jason moved without hesitation, sprinting toward the burning rear section as the drone prepared another missile strike. Jason! Elena shouted after him.
He ignored her. The rear compartment had become an inferno of sparks and twisted metal. One operative lay trapped beneath collapsed debris while the drone hovered outside the shattered hull searching for targets through the smoke. Jason dropped beside the pinned operative and tried lifting the debris.
Too heavy. The drone's targeting laser swept across the compartment walls. Go, the trapped operative yelled. Leave me.
Jason planted both feet against the floor and strained harder.
Muscles trembled beneath bloodstained fabric. The metal shifted slightly but not enough.
Outside, the drone's missile launcher rotated into firing position. Then Elena appeared through the smoke beside him.
Move over, she snapped.
Together they forced the debris upward just enough for the operative to crawl free moments before Jason grabbed a loose magnetic clamp from the wall. He hurled it through the shattered opening directly onto the drone's stabilizer rotor.
Sparks erupted instantly.
The drone spun wildly out of control before smashing into the tunnel wall behind them in a fireball that collapsed part of the passage entirely.
The train escaped the blast by seconds.
Breathing heavily, Elena looked toward Jason through drifting smoke. You really don't know how to run away from explosions like a normal person.
Jason coughed from the smoke. I've never met a normal person.
The train continued east for several hours through isolated mountain routes while repairs were made to damaged systems.
Eventually the tracks emerged from the tunnels into vast wilderness where pine forests stretched endlessly beneath moonlight.
Snow still covered the higher elevations despite summer reaching the lowlands weeks earlier. Inside the operation's car tension settled into exhausted silence. Some operatives slept beside weapons crates while others monitored transmissions from the capital. Marcus sat alone near the radio equipment replaying fragments of tribunal footage on a small screen.
Jason approached quietly.
You should rest. Marcus kept staring at the footage.
I used to tell recruits stories about you. Jason leaned against the nearby wall.
Hopefully the heroic versions.
Marcus gave a bitter laugh. Mostly the reckless ones. He paused.
After Port Aldder, I spent years convincing myself you changed.
It was easier than believing I abandoned you. Jason remained silent for several seconds.
You were trying to survive.
Marcus finally looked up.
You always excuse people who hurt you.
Not always. Then why me? Jason's answer came immediately. Because you were 19 and terrified. Marcus lowered his eyes again.
I heard the wall collapse, he said quietly.
For years I kept thinking about the sound. Jason remembered it too. Entire districts vanishing beneath fire and concrete. Soldiers screaming through broken comm channels. The memory never really faded.
I thought you died down there, Marcus admitted.
Part of me hoped you had. Jason nodded once without judgment. Marcus swallowed hard. I'm sorry. The apology lingered heavily between them. Jason eventually answered in the simplest way possible. I know.
It was not dramatic forgiveness.
Not complete healing.
But it was enough for Marcus to finally breathe again. Near dawn the train reached an isolated valley hidden between steep mountains. Thick fog drifted through the forests surrounding a massive hydroelectric dam built decades earlier during the border wars. The rail line ended at a heavily fortified compound embedded directly into the mountainside beside the dam.
Automated turrets tracked the train as it approached. Elena stared through the window. This is the archive facility? Mira nodded.
Officially it's an abandoned energy reserve station.
And unofficially? Voss stores enough blackmail in there to control half the continent.
Armed guards loyal to Mira secured the perimeter while the group entered the underground facility through blast-proof security doors. The interior felt less like a government archive and more like a buried fortress.
Endless corridors lined with reinforced server vaults stretched deep into the mountain beneath harsh white lights.
Data terminals hummed quietly beside stacks of physical files sealed in climate-controlled chambers.
Marcus looked stunned. How many secrets are down here? Mira answered flatly. Too many.
Jason moved directly toward the central archive room as though he already knew the layout.
Elena followed beside him. You've been here before. Once, Jason admitted. Years ago. Why? He stopped outside a sealed security door. Because this is where I learned Port Aldder wasn't an accident. Mira entered access codes into the control panel.
And where he almost died getting the proof out. The vault doors slowly opened revealing a vast circular chamber filled with suspended holographic displays and encrypted data cores. At the center stood a single terminal isolated behind armored glass. Jason approached it carefully.
Voss keeps the master ledger offline. Marcus frowned. Meaning? Meaning if we release this publicly, every hidden operation tied to his network becomes traceable. Elena crossed her arms. Then why does this feel like a terrible idea?
Jason glanced toward her.
Because once it starts, there's no controlling what happens next.
Before anyone could continue, one of Myra's operatives burst into the chamber breathless.
We have incoming aircraft. Mira stiffened. How many? Too many. Sirens activated throughout the facility immediately.
Security monitors lit up showing military gunships descending through the valley while armored convoys approached the dam from mountain roads below. Marcus stared at the screens in disbelief.
That's Republic military. Jason's expression turned grim. Voss convinced them we're the threat. Mira grabbed a rifle from the wall rack. Perimeter teams won't hold long. Elena looked toward Jason. Can we transmit the files remotely? Eventually. Jason accessed the terminal. Rapidly. But the ledger's fragmented across physical drives. We need time to assemble everything.
Explosions suddenly shook the facility as gunships opened fire on outer defenses. Dust rained from the ceiling. Operatives rushed through corridors preparing barricades while warning lights bathed the bunker in pulsing red.
Marcus checked ammunition with unsteady hands. How bad is this about to get?
Mira answered while loading fresh magazines into her rifle.
Extremely. Jason studied the tactical displays carefully. The dam. Elena looked confused. What about it? Jason pointed toward structural schematics. If they breach the lower turbine level during an assault, the entire valley floods.
Marcus stared at him.
You think Voss would destroy the dam? Jason met his brother's eyes.
He destroyed a city to protect himself once already. Outside, the first missiles struck the upper defensive towers.
The mountain echoed with thunderous impacts while alarm systems screamed through every corridor. Myra's operatives returned fire from fortified positions around the compound entrance, but the attacking force vastly outnumbered them.
Jason continued extracting files from the archive terminal with relentless focus despite the chaos building around them.
Elena moved beside him. Tell me what to do.
Jason glanced at her briefly before handing over a secondary data drive.
Transfer every ledger fragment onto this backup. If anything happens, you leave with it. Elena immediately shook her head. Not this time.
Elena, her voice cut sharply through the noise around them. I already buried you once because you decided protecting everyone mattered more than letting people stand beside you. Jason tried to respond, but she stepped closer. If this falls apart, we deal with it together. For a moment the war, the betrayal, the years apart all seemed to narrow into the space between them. Then another explosion rocked the chamber violently enough to crack several display screens.
Myra's voice shouted through the intercom. Enemy breach on the upper levels. Gunfire erupted overhead. Marcus looked toward the ceiling. They're inside. Jason grabbed the backup drive from the terminal and handed it directly to Elena anyway. If the ledger gets out, Voss loses everything.
Elena clenched the drive tightly but did not argue further. She understood now that this was larger than revenge. Larger even than the Republic itself.
Footsteps thundered through the outer corridors moments later as enemy soldiers pushed deeper into the facility. Mira and her operatives engaged them immediately.
Muzzle flashes lit the hallways in rapid violent bursts while smoke filled the ventilation system. Jason pulled Marcus toward a secondary control room overlooking the turbine chamber far below the mountain.
Massive generators roared beneath reinforced glass windows while water thundered through giant spillway tunnels beneath them. What's the plan? Marcus shouted over the noise.
Jason studied the control systems rapidly.
If Voss can't secure the archive, he'll destroy it. And the dam with it. Exactly. Marcus followed his gaze toward several blinking warning indicators. He already planted charges? Jason nodded grimly. Fail-safe protocol. Marcus swore under his breath. Can we disarm them? Maybe. Jason grabbed emergency maintenance schematics from the console. But the detonators are wired through the lower turbine level. Elena entered the control room with Mira seconds later while distant gunfire echoed closer through the corridors.
Myra's coat was streaked with blood, though not all of it appeared to be hers.
We're losing the upper sectors, she reported. How long until the files upload? Jason checked the progress bar. 20 minutes. Mira laughed bitterly. We have 5 at best.
Then the entire facility suddenly went dark. Emergency systems activated a second later, bathing the control room in dim crimson lighting.
Across the valley outside, massive floodlights illuminated the mountainside as military loudspeakers echoed through the stormy dawn.
Minister Voss's voice filled the valley, cold and controlled.
Jason Kane. Surrender the archive immediately and this facility will be spared. Jason walked toward the observation window overlooking the dam.
Snow and rain whipped across the mountains outside while helicopters circled above like predators.
Voss's voice continued through the loudspeakers. You still believe this is about justice?
But you are about to drown thousands of civilians living downstream simply to expose secrets they will never understand.
Elena looked toward Jason carefully.
She knew that expression on his face now. The same expression he wore in every memory before choosing to sacrifice himself for others.
Jason pressed a hand against the cold glass overlooking the roaring black water beneath the dam.
Then he turned slowly back toward the others.
We're running out of time.
And somewhere deep below the mountain, hidden explosives armed themselves with a low mechanical click that echoed through the turbine tunnels like the beginning of another disaster waiting to be born. The sound of the explosives arming beneath the dam changed the atmosphere inside the control room instantly. Until that moment everyone had still been operating under the illusion that there might be enough time to outmaneuver Voss, enough time to expose the archive, enough time to survive afterward.
But the low mechanical clicks echoing through the turbine levels stripped away every comforting lie.
Jason stared at the structural schematics glowing across the emergency monitor while water thundered through the mountain beneath their feet with enough force to erase entire towns if the dam failed. Marcus paced beside the console, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful.
There has to be another way. Jason zoomed in on the lower levels.
Red warning markers blinked deep inside the turbine network. 3 explosive clusters, he said quietly.
1 on each primary support column. Mira crossed her arms. Meaning if one detonates, the others chain react.
And the entire valley floods. Elena looked toward the monitor showing downstream civilian zones. Villages.
Hydroelectric worker camps. Farming communities.
Tens of thousands of people sleeping completely unaware that their lives now balanced on the decisions being made inside this mountain. How long? She asked softly. Jason checked the timer embedded in the detonation system.
17 minutes.
Marcus ran both hands through his hair. We can't fight through an army and defuse explosives at the same time. Gunfire erupted somewhere above them, followed by muffled screams. Mira listened briefly before speaking into her radio.
Fall back to Sector 4. Seal the upper blast doors. Static crackled back through the speaker along with panicked shouting. One of her operatives yelled, "They're bringing breaching charges." The transmission abruptly cut out. Mira lowered the radio slowly.
Her face did not change, but Jason knew her well enough to see the grief beneath the stillness.
How many people did you bring here? He asked. 32. And now?
She looked away for half a second.
Enough to keep fighting. Another explosion shook dust from the ceiling. Elena moved beside Jason. Tell me the truth.
He met her eyes immediately. There's probably no scenario where all of us walk out. She absorbed the answer without flinching.
Okay.
Marcus stared at both of them in disbelief.
Okay? That's your response? Elena looked toward him calmly. Panicking won't stop the explosives. Jason turned back toward the schematics. The detonators are manually protected. Someone wired the system so remote shutdown becomes impossible once the countdown starts. Marcus frowned.
Meaning somebody has to reach each charge physically.
Yes. That's suicide. Jason did not answer. The silence itself became confirmation. Marcus shook his head immediately. No. Jason finally looked at him.
Marcus, no. His voice cracked with sudden anger.
I already spent years believing I failed you once.
I'm not standing here while you volunteer to die again.
Jason stepped closer. Listen to me carefully.
If those charges go off, everyone downstream dies.
Then we find another option. There isn't one.
The room fell silent except for the distant roar of gunfire and rushing water.
Elena watched Jason's face carefully and realized something terrifying.
He had already made his decision before any of them entered the room. She stepped between the brothers.
How many charges can one person disable?
Jason hesitated. One, maybe two, depending on the wiring.
And there are three. Mira immediately understood. We split up. Marcus looked horrified. Absolutely not. Mira ignored him.
I'll take the western turbine. You don't know the system, Jason replied.
I know explosives. Elena stepped forward next.
I'll take the eastern column. Jason turned sharply toward her.
No, you don't get to decide that for me anymore.
Elena, you spent years carrying everyone's lives on your back while shutting people
out.
Her eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady.
I'm done letting you face everything alone.
Before Jason could argue further, emergency lights flickered violently. The main security screen switched feeds automatically, revealing Minister Voss standing inside a mobile command vehicle somewhere outside the dam. Snow blew behind him while military officers rushed around the convoy. You continue to misunderstand your role in this story, Commander Kane, Voss said through the loudspeakers. You believe yourself morally different from me because your sacrifices wear the mask of compassion.
Jason stared coldly at the screen.
Voss continued, but you and I are the same. We both decide who lives and who dies for the sake of stability.
Elena looked toward Jason, waiting for his response. For several seconds he said nothing.
Then he activated the external communication system.
No, he answered calmly. The difference is that I still hate making the choice. Voss studied him through the monitor with faint disappointment. You could have ruled this country beside me after the war. Marcus blinked in shock. What? Jason's expression darkened slightly. Voss smiled thinly. He never told you?
The minister stepped closer to the camera.
After Port Aldder, I offered your brother everything. Power. Protection.
A chance to reshape the Republic properly.
Elena slowly turned toward Jason. Is that true? Jason answered without looking away from the screen. Yes.
Marcus stared at him.
And you never mentioned this? It didn't matter. Voss laughed softly.
You refused because you still believed ordinary people deserved honesty.
Even after everything they did to you.
His smile faded. That idealism is exactly why you were always destined to lose. The transmission ended abruptly.
Silence settled over the room again. Marcus looked shaken. You could have cleared your name. Jason finally looked toward him.
At the cost of becoming him.
No one spoke after that.
There was nothing left to argue about. The countdown continued ticking downward across the monitor while the battle above them intensified.
Finally Mira checked her weapon and headed for the corridor. We're wasting time. Marcus grabbed her arm. You barely know us. Why are you willing to die for this? Myra's artificial eye reflected the red emergency lights. Because people like Voss survive when everyone decides saving themselves is more important.
She pulled free gently.
I'm tired of surviving. She disappeared into the corridor before anyone could stop her. Elena turned toward Jason next.
Show me how to disarm the charges. He opened his mouth to refuse again, then stopped. He saw it clearly now. The determination in her face was not desperation. It was choice. The same choice he had made his entire life. Slowly he pulled up the explosive schematics and began explaining the trigger mechanisms. The detonators are pressure-linked, he said. Cut the wrong wire too fast and the charge arms instantly. Elena listened carefully. How much time after activation? 3 seconds. Comforting.
Despite everything, Jason almost smiled.
Marcus watched the two of them with conflicted emotion.
What about me? Jason handed him a rifle. You keep the upload alive. Marcus looked furious. That's not enough. It's the most important part. Jason stepped closer.
If we fail down there, somebody still needs to expose the ledger. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue again, but the countdown clock killed the impulse.
14 minutes.
Elena secured the backup drive inside her coat. If this works and you die anyway, she said quietly to Jason, I'm going to be extremely angry.
Jason answered softly, wouldn't be the first time. For one fragile second they almost kissed. The feeling passed when another explosion shook the hallway outside. Gunfire erupted much closer now.
Enemy forces had breached another
sector. Marcus checked the security feed.
Soldiers were advancing through the upper corridors using thermal scanners and heavy armor. They'll reach this level soon.
Jason nodded once. Then we move now. The turbine tunnels beneath the dam felt like descending into the center of a machine built by giants. Massive pipes vibrated with crushing water pressure while steam hissed through vents along narrow metal walkways suspended over darkness.
Emergency lights cast shifting shadows across the concrete walls as the group split at a central junction deep underground.
Mira headed west without another word.
Elena moved east after Jason gave her one final set of instructions. Marcus remained at the central relay station near the archive uplink preparing to defend the upload terminal. Before leaving, Jason stopped beside him briefly.
Marcus.
His younger brother looked up. If the upload completes before we return, release everything.
Marcus swallowed hard. Even if it tears the Republic apart? Jason thought about the tribunal. The lies. The war. The graves. People deserve the truth before they decide what comes next. Then he disappeared into the southern turbine corridor alone.
The lower tunnels grew hotter the deeper he descended. Water roared through nearby pipes loud enough to shake the walls continuously. Jason moved quickly past warning signs and maintenance ladders until he reached the first explosive cluster attached directly to the primary support column.
Military-grade charges. Sophisticated. Built to guarantee structural collapse.
He knelt beside the device and immediately realized the problem. There was an anti-tamper relay hidden beneath the wiring assembly.
Voss had anticipated sabotage. Jason exhaled slowly. Of course you did.
Above him, distant gunfire echoed through ventilation shafts.
Meanwhile, Elena reached the eastern support column after navigating several partially flooded maintenance tunnels.
She crouched beside the explosive housing while water sprayed from damaged pipes nearby.
Jason's instructions replayed through her mind as she carefully removed the outer panel.
Her hands trembled slightly at first, then steadied. Years as a combat medic had taught her how to function inside fear instead of fighting it.
She focused on the wires. Red. Blue. Copper relay beneath the timer.
Suddenly footsteps splashed through the tunnel behind her. Elena spun with her pistol raised just as an enemy soldier emerged through the steam-filled corridor. The soldier froze in equal surprise. They stared at each other for half a second before he raised his weapon.
Elena fired first. The gunshot thundered through the tunnel.
The soldier collapsed into the rushing water.
Elena stood breathing hard, staring at the body.
She had spent years saving lives after the war, trying to leave violence behind. Now here she was again beneath a mountain with blood on her hands because history refused to stay buried. Her radio crackled suddenly.
Jason's voice. Status? Elena forced herself to refocus. Working on it. You okay?
She glanced once more at the dead soldier before answering quietly, not really. Several levels above them, Marcus barricaded the archive relay chamber while the upload continued inching forward across encrypted networks worldwide.
91%.
Sweat ran down his face as explosions echoed closer through the corridors outside. Remaining operatives fired desperately from defensive positions while enemy troops advanced room by room.
Marcus checked his ammunition nervously.
He had spent years working intelligence operations behind screens in secure offices.
Real combat felt different. Louder. Faster. More personal.
A wounded operative nearby looked toward him.
Commander Kane would know what to do. Marcus almost laughed bitterly. Yeah, he muttered. That's always been the problem. Suddenly the blast doors exploded inward.
Enemy soldiers stormed the chamber through smoke and fire. Marcus reacted instinctively, opening fire as chaos
consumed the room. Bullets shattered consoles while sparks erupted from damaged equipment.
The upload percentage continued climbing behind him.
94. 95.
Down in the turbine chamber, Jason carefully disconnected the anti-tamper relay from the explosive housing while sweat rolled down his forehead from the intense heat surrounding the support column. The timer blinked steadily above the device.
8 minutes remaining.
He reached for the final stabilizer wire when a familiar voice echoed through the chamber behind him.
Still trying to save everyone.
Jason closed his eyes briefly before turning. Minister Voss stood on the upper maintenance platform surrounded by armed soldiers. Snowmelt dripped from the minister's coat onto the steel grating beneath his feet. He looked calm despite the war unfolding throughout the dam. "You came personally," Jason observed.
"I wanted to see how this ended." Voss descended the stairs slowly. "Do you know what your tragedy has always been, Jason?" Jason kept one hand near the explosive wiring. "Your speeches never get shorter." Voss ignored the remark.
"You mistake sacrifice for morality." He gestured toward the explosive device.
"Look at yourself.
Willing to die for people who hated you yesterday and may hate you again tomorrow."
Jason's expression remained steady. "Maybe." Voss stopped several feet away. "Then why keep saving them?" For the first time all night Jason answered without anger. "Because somebody should."
Silence filled the roaring turbine chamber as water thundered through the dam around them and the countdown continued ticking toward disaster. Voss studied Jason for several long seconds as the timer above the explosive device continued its relentless countdown, the red numbers reflecting faintly across the rushing water and steel around them.
7 minutes and 14 seconds.
The turbine chamber trembled constantly beneath the pressure of millions of tons of water held back by the dam overhead.
Steam drifted through the air in ghost-like waves while armed soldiers spread out along the upper walkways surrounding the chamber. None of them fired.
Even they seemed caught in the strange gravity of the moment, watching two men who had shaped the Republic in completely different ways stand face to face at the edge of catastrophe.
Voss finally descended the last few steps until he stood only a short distance from Jason beside the explosive column. "Do you know what I remember most about you?" the minister asked quietly.
Jason continued working carefully on the detonator wiring without looking up.
"I'm sure you'll tell me anyway."
"The northern famine camps."
Voss's voice carried unexpected softness now, almost reflective. "Most officers avoided those places. Too much suffering. Too many starving civilians. But you walked through every tent personally."
Jason's hands paused briefly over the wires.
"People needed supplies." "No," Voss corrected gently. "People needed hope.
And somehow you gave it to them even when there was none left."
He looked almost disappointed. "That is why you could never survive politics."
Jason glanced toward him.
"Funny. I survived prison." A faint smile touched Voss's face before disappearing again. "Do you know what happens after today if you succeed?" Jason returned his focus to the device. "Probably something unpleasant.
The Republic fractures.
Military districts split allegiance. Foreign powers move against weakened borders. There will be riots. Assassinations. Economic collapse." Voss spread his hands slightly. "You think exposing truth ends corruption? It doesn't. It simply removes the illusion holding civilization together."
Jason carefully disconnected another stabilizer line. Maybe civilization built on lies deserves to shake apart. One of the soldiers shifted uneasily nearby.
Voss noticed but continued calmly. You still believe ordinary people want truth? Most don't. They want certainty. Safety. Someone else to blame when the world disappoints them.
His eyes sharpened. They turned you into a monster because monsters are comforting.
Easier than accepting that entire governments sacrifice innocents every day.
Jason finally looked directly at him.
And you used that?
Of course I did.
Voss's honesty felt almost more disturbing than deception. Power belongs to those willing to carry ugly responsibilities.
He stepped closer to the explosive device.
You know the worst part? A small piece of you understands me. Jason's expression darkened slightly because it was true.
After years spent surviving shadows, manipulation, and impossible choices, part of him understood exactly how men like Voss were created. That understanding terrified him more than hatred ever could. Suddenly Jason's radio crackled violently.
Elena's strained voice broke through static. Jason Eastern charge disarmed. Relief flickered across his face instantly. Are you hurt? Nothing fatal.
Gunfire thundered somewhere behind her.
We've got company though. The transmission cut out abruptly. Jason's eyes hardened. Voss noticed immediately. You love her. Jason said nothing. That was your other weakness, Voss continued softly.
You never learned how to stop caring. Jason returned his attention to the detonator.
And you forgot how.
Above them, the soldiers exchanged nervous glances as the timer continued falling.
5 minutes 42 seconds. One of the officers finally stepped toward Voss carefully. Minister, we need to evacuate if the charges remain active. Voss did not even look at him. Leave if you're afraid.
The officer hesitated, then slowly backed away. Jason disconnected the final stabilizer relay and carefully removed the trigger core from the explosive housing.
The timer froze instantly.
One charge disabled. But before he could stand fully, Voss suddenly pulled a concealed pistol from beneath his coat and fired directly into the control panel beside the support column.
Sparks exploded from the machinery.
Warning alarms screamed instantly throughout the chamber.
Jason spun toward the damaged system. What did you do? Voss lowered the pistol calmly. Accelerated the inevitable.
Red warning lights flashed across the turbine consoles.
Structural failure detected. Emergency floodgates opening. Jason's stomach dropped. The damaged support systems began overloading under the sudden pressure imbalance.
Water burst through nearby pipes with explosive force.
You're going to destroy the dam anyway, Jason realized. Voss looked almost sad. History was never going to let either of us walk away from this.
The minister raised the pistol again.
Jason moved instantly as the shot fired.
The bullet grazed his shoulder instead of his chest while he slammed Voss backward into the metal railing overlooking the turbine pit. Soldiers shouted around them as steam erupted from ruptured pipes across the chamber.
The entire structure groaned violently. Voss struck Jason across the face with the pistol hard enough to split skin near his eyebrow.
Jason retaliated with a brutal punch that sent the weapon skidding across the wet floor. The two men crashed into the railing together while below them massive turbine blades spun through raging black water.
Voss fought viciously despite his age, driven less by survival now than furious desperation.
You think they'll thank you for this, he shouted while struggling against Jason.
After the fear fades they'll find another villain.
Jason shoved him hard against the railing.
Maybe. Another violent tremor shook the chamber. Pieces of concrete crashed from the ceiling into the water below. Jason grabbed Voss by the coat. But it won't be me anymore.
Suddenly the railing beneath them snapped from structural stress.
Both men plunged sideways toward the turbine pit.
Jason caught a dangling maintenance chain at the last second with one hand while Voss barely managed to cling to Jason's arm above the churning water far below.
Steam and alarms roared around them.
Jason strained against the chain as Voss hung beneath him, gripping desperately onto his sleeve. For the first time since meeting him, genuine fear consumed the minister's face completely. "Jason," he gasped, slipping lower.
"Please." The word echoed strangely between them. Not command. Not manipulation. Simple fear. Jason looked down at the man who had destroyed countless lives, including his own. One movement would end everything. Voss seemed to realize the same thought instantly. "You're not a killer," he whispered desperately. Jason's injured shoulder trembled violently from the strain. Below them the turbine waters churned like darkness itself.
Then Jason heard another sound through the chaos.
Elena's voice screaming his name somewhere above.
Jason looked upward briefly toward the maintenance platform where Elena had just entered the chamber alongside several wounded operatives. Her face turned white at the sight before her.
"Jason!"
She rushed toward the broken railing.
Voss slipped another inch lower. "Don't let go," he rasped.
Jason stared at him for one long moment. Then he spoke quietly through blood and
exhaustion. "You still don't understand."
With immense effort he hauled both of them upward toward the remaining section of platform. Elena grabbed Jason's arm while other operatives pulled Voss onto solid ground moments before the damaged chain snapped completely into the turbine waters below.
Voss collapsed coughing violently against the floor. He looked up at Jason in disbelief. "Why?" Jason stood over him breathing hard. "Because if I become you to stop you, then you win anyway." Before Voss could respond, a deafening explosion shook the chamber from the upper levels of the dam. Emergency sirens changed tone instantly.
Marcus's voice burst through the radio through heavy static.
"Jason!
The archive upload is complete, but they breached the relay station."
Gunfire thundered behind him. "Marcus?" No answer came except static. Elena immediately looked toward Jason. "Go."
He hesitated only briefly before sprinting toward the upper maintenance stairs. The deeper sections of the dam had become a war zone by the time Jason reached the relay levels.
Smoke filled the corridors.
Sprinkler systems sprayed water over shattered lights and fallen bodies. Remaining operatives exchanged fire with Republic soldiers through ruined control rooms while the facility itself groaned under increasing structural stress from the damaged turbines below.
Jason moved through the chaos with terrifying focus.
He found Marcus inside the archive chamber kneeling behind an overturned console firing toward the blast doors where enemy troops continued pushing inward. The upload terminal behind him flashed complete across every monitor. Files were already spreading through public networks worldwide faster than government sensors could contain them. Marcus looked up in visible relief when Jason appeared.
"Took you long enough?" Jason immediately joined the firefight beside him. "You alive?" "Mostly." Marcus reloaded quickly.
"The whole world has the ledger now." Outside the chamber, distant explosions echoed across the valley as military units began retreating from the unstable dam.
News alerts flooded surviving monitors with breaking headlines. Wartime conspiracy exposed. Government officials implicated. Mass protests erupt across multiple cities. International tribunal demands arrests.
The Republic was changing in real time.
Whether towards something better or far worse, nobody knew yet. Then another violent tremor shook the facility harder than any before.
Cracks spread across the archive chamber walls. Water burst through the ceiling pipes. Jason looked toward the structural monitors and immediately realized the truth. The turbine damage below had become irreversible.
"We need to evacuate now," he said sharply. Marcus checked the exits. Most routes are collapsed.
Elena and Mira arrived moments later through the smoke-filled corridor. Myra's arm bled heavily from a gunshot wound, but she remained standing through sheer stubbornness.
"Western tunnels are gone," she reported. "Only the upper spillway access remains open." Jason pulled Marcus upright. "Then we move."
The group fought their way through collapsing corridors as the dam continued failing around them.
Concrete cracked.
Flood alarms screamed endlessly. Entire sections of the facility disappeared beneath surging water while surviving soldiers and operatives alike abandoned the battle simply to survive. For the first time that night nobody cared about sides anymore. Everyone was running from the same disaster. They finally reached the upper spillway platform high above the valley just as dawn sunlight broke through the storm clouds completely. The view stole the breath from everyone present. Below them the valley stretched for miles beneath golden morning light while emergency sirens wailed faintly from distant towns already evacuating downstream communities. Helicopters circled overhead rescuing survivors from the collapsing lower sectors of the dam. But the central structure itself continued splitting apart beneath enormous pressure. Mira stared at the widening cracks across the concrete supports. It's not going to hold. Jason looked toward the main spillway controls positioned on an isolated platform directly above the failing pressure gates. Understanding hit him instantly. The emergency floodgates never opened fully. Marcus followed his gaze. What does that mean? Jason answered quietly. Too much pressure still trapped behind the dam. Elena realized it a second later. If the gates stay jammed when the structure fails, the flood wave wipes out every town below. Silence fell again. Jason already knew what had to happen. Elena grabbed his arm before he could move. No, he looked at her gently. The manual release is on the outer platform. Then we find another way. There isn't time. The dam groaned like a dying giant beneath their feet. Massive chunks of concrete crashed into the valley below. Jason touched Elena's face softly for the first time in years. I spent so long surviving that I forgot how to live. His voice remained calm despite everything collapsing around them. You reminded me. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Don't do this. Marcus stepped forward too. Jason, there has to be another option. Jason looked between them both. His family. Broken and rebuilt through fire and grief and impossible choices. Take care of each other this time, he said quietly. Then he turned and sprinted toward the outer spillway platform as the dam began to collapse around him. Jason ran across the outer spillway bridge while the dam disintegrated beneath the rising pressure of the reservoir behind it. The narrow metal walkway shook violently with every structural impact, bolts ripping free from the support beams as water exploded through widening fractures in the concrete walls below. Sirens screamed through the valley while helicopters veered away from the unstable structure overhead. Elena pushed forward after him instinctively, but Marcus caught her arm before she reached the collapsing bridge. You can't make it across, he shouted over the chaos. She struggled against him anyway. Let me go. Jason reached the midpoint of the spillway platform just as a massive crack split through the concrete beneath his feet. The bridge tilted sharply sideways. Metal screamed. One of the support cables snapped free and whipped through the air like a cannon blast. Jason barely managed to grab the railing before the entire lower section collapsed into the raging water hundreds of feet below. Elena's scream vanished beneath the thunder of the dam breaking apart. Jason pulled himself upright and kept moving. Every step now carried the weight of finality. Ahead of him, isolated at the far end of the bridge above the main floodgate turbines, stood the manual release wheel. Rusted. Massive. Built decades earlier as a last resort failsafe in case automated systems failed completely. Snowmelt rain lashed across the platform while water burst through cracks in the dam walls around him with increasing violence. Behind the floodgates rested enough pressure to erase entire towns downstream if released too late. Jason reached the control wheel and immediately understood the problem. The locking mechanism had warped under the structural stress. It would not turn easily. Of course it wouldn't. He braced both hands against the frozen steel and pushed with everything left in his body. Nothing moved. Behind him another section of the dam exploded outward. A wall of water burst through the lower support columns, sending shockwaves through the entire structure. Jason gritted his teeth harder and forced the wheel again. Slowly, painfully, the mechanism shifted half an inch with a scream of metal grinding against metal. Back on the upper platform, Elena watched helplessly while tears mixed with rain on her face. "Jason," she screamed again, though she knew he could barely hear her. Mira stood nearby, pressing one bloody hand against her wounded arm while staring grimly at the failing structure. "If he opens those gates in time," she said quietly, "the flood pressure might disperse enough to save the valley." Marcus looked toward her sharply. "Might?" Mira did not answer. She did not need to. Jason forced the wheel another turn. Veins strained along his arms while pain burned through his gunshot wounds and battered body. Warning alarms blared from the floodgate system as ancient gears slowly awakened deep beneath the dam. Somewhere below, massive steel gates began shifting for the first time in years. The reservoir behind the dam roared louder instantly. Then Jason heard footsteps approaching across the unstable bridge behind him. He turned sharply. Voss. The minister staggered across the damaged walkway, bleeding from the forehead, coat torn by debris, but still alive through sheer stubbornness. He held no weapon now. Only exhaustion. "You really are going to die for them," Voss said through ragged breaths. Jason turned the wheel again without stopping. "Looks that way." Voss stared out across the valley where evacuation sirens echoed faintly from distant towns. "Do you know what happens after today?" he asked quietly. "Without the illusion of unity, this country tears itself apart. The Senate fractures. Border states rebel. Foreign governments move in." He stepped closer slowly. "People will kill each other trying to decide whose truth matters most." Jason continued, forcing the wheel around another painful rotation. The floodgates below groaned louder now. Water erupted through the lower spillways in violent torrents. "Maybe," he admitted. "But at least the choice will belong to them." Voss looked at him almost sadly. "You still believe people are better than they are?" Jason paused, then, breathing hard, rain running down his face. "No," he answered honestly. "I just think they deserve the chance to try." The bridge beneath them lurched violently again. Large sections of concrete collapsed into the floodwaters below. Voss grabbed the railing to stay upright while Jason nearly lost his footing beside the control wheel. The dam would not survive much longer. Suddenly Voss laughed softly to himself. It was not mocking this time. It sounded tired. Defeated. "Do you know why I hated you?" he asked. Jason said nothing. Voss stared toward the valley. "Because every terrible thing I ever justified for stability," his voice weakened slightly. "You survived without becoming cruel." For a long moment neither man moved. Then Voss stepped forward unexpectedly and placed both hands against the release wheel beside Jason. Jason looked at him in shock. "What are you doing?" Voss gave a faint, humorless smile. "Apparently making one final terrible decision." Together they forced the wheel forward as the dam collapsed around them. The floodgate system screamed alive beneath the mountain. Massive steel barriers finally unlocked completely. An enormous surge of water exploded through the spillways in controlled torrents, racing down the valley channels instead of building toward catastrophic rupture. Far below, evacuation convoys accelerated away from the riverbanks while emergency broadcasts ordered entire districts toward higher ground. The pressure behind the dam dropped rapidly. But not fast enough. Cracks spread across the central support towers like lightning through glass. Voss saw it first. "It's going." Jason looked up just as the main structural column began collapsing directly toward the spillway bridge. "Run!" Voss shouted suddenly. Jason hesitated only half a second before grabbing the minister's arm and sprinting back across the failing walkway. Metal snapped beneath them while entire sections plunged into the floodwaters below. Elena screamed Jason's name again from the upper platform as he raced toward them through smoke and debris. For one impossible second it looked like he might actually make it. Then the central tower collapsed. The world disappeared beneath a roar louder than war itself. Concrete, steel, and water exploded outward across the valley. The spillway bridge shattered beneath Jason and Voss instantly. Elena saw Jason throw Voss toward the stable section of platform moments before the collapsing structure swallowed him completely beneath a wall of debris and raging floodwater.
Jason!
Elena broke free from Marcus and ran toward the ruined edge of the platform despite Mira shouting after her. The dam continued collapsing in sections while emergency helicopters circled through clouds of dust and spray overhead. Below, the spillway had become a violent river of shattered concrete and white water. There was no sign of Jason anywhere. Elena dropped to her knees at the edge of the ruined platform, staring into the chaos below with a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream trapped in her throat. Marcus reached her seconds later, breathing hard, unable to speak himself. Nearby, soldiers dragged the barely conscious Voss away from the collapsing structure under armed guard. The minister looked toward the floodwaters where Jason vanished.
For the first time in decades, genuine grief crossed his face.
Then another section of the dam exploded apart, forcing everyone toward evacuation helicopters as the remaining structure threatened total collapse.
Elena resisted violently when soldiers tried pulling her away. He's still down there.
Marcus grabbed her shoulders.
Elena! She looked at him with tears streaming uncontrollably now. I can't lose him again.
Marcus's own voice nearly broke. If we stay here, he dies for nothing. The words finally reached her through the shock.
Barely.
Together they boarded the last evacuation helicopter moments before the remaining central tower of the dam collapsed entirely into the valley below.
The blast wave rocked the aircraft violently as they lifted into the storm-filled sky. From above, the destruction looked almost unreal. Water surged through the spillways in enormous controlled torrents while emergency crews evacuated downstream zones.
The valley had survived.
Damaged. Flooded. But alive.
Jason's choice had saved thousands. Yet as Elena stared down at the ruins disappearing beneath clouds and spray, none of it felt like victory.
Hours later, the Republic changed forever.
The archive ledger spread across every global network, impossible to suppress completely. Arrest warrants were issued for military officials, senators, intelligence directors, and corporate executives tied to wartime atrocities and political corruption. Protests consumed major cities while emergency governments formed across several regions.
Some people celebrated the exposure.
Others called it national betrayal. Old alliances shattered overnight.
Entire news networks collapsed beneath the weight of revelations too large to contain.
Through all of it, one image dominated every broadcast in the world: Jason Kane standing before the tribunal in chains while memories proved the man condemned as a traitor had spent years sacrificing everything to protect the very people who destroyed him. By evening, rescue teams combed the flooded valley beneath the ruined dam, searching through debris fields and shattered concrete. Hope faded with every passing hour. Elena refused to leave the emergency command center overlooking the search operation despite exhaustion hollowing her face. Marcus sat nearby listening to fragmented radio reports while Mira leaned silently against the wall with her wounded arm bandaged heavily.
Nobody spoke much anymore.
Finally, near midnight, one rescue diver entered the command tent dripping with river water. "We found someone," he said carefully. Elena stood so fast her chair crashed backward.
"Where?" "Northern Spillway Bank."
Her heart pounded violently as she followed the rescue crews through freezing rain toward the medical evacuation zone beside the flooded river. Flashlights cut through darkness while helicopters hovered overhead, illuminating the shattered valley below. Then she saw the stretcher surrounded by medics. Jason lay unconscious beneath thermal blankets soaked in blood and river water, oxygen mask covering part of his face while doctors worked frantically around him.
Elena stopped breathing for a second. He looked pale. Broken. But alive.
One medic noticed her.
"Are you family?" Elena could barely answer. "Yes."
"He has severe trauma, hypothermia, internal bleeding," the medic kept talking, but Elena already moved beside the stretcher.
Jason's eyes remained closed. His pulse weak beneath the monitors.
She took his hand carefully as though afraid he might disappear if touched too hard. "You idiot," she whispered through tears.
"You absolute impossible idiot." For a long moment nothing happened.
Then Jason's fingers twitched weakly against hers. His eyes opened slightly beneath the harsh rescue lights.
Disoriented. Exhausted. But alive. He looked at Elena for several seconds before managing the faintest rasp of a voice. Did we save the dam? Elena laughed and cried at the same time. No, Jason frowned weakly. That seems bad.
She leaned down and pressed her forehead gently against his. The valley survived.
He closed his eyes briefly in relief.
Around them the rescue crews continued moving through rain and floodlight while helicopters thundered overhead carrying survivors home. Beneath the fractured skies of a republic forced at last to confront the truth. Jason drifted in and out of consciousness for the next 3 days beneath the sterile lights of a military hospital that no longer knew whether to classify him as a criminal, a national hero, or evidence in the largest political scandal in Republic history. Armed guards still stood outside his room out of protocol more than intent, though most no longer looked at him with suspicion.
Some looked ashamed. Others looked quietly grateful.
News coverage played constantly throughout the hospital corridors as governments collapsed, emergency tribunals formed, and protests spread across nearly every major city in the Republic. Entire intelligence divisions were dismantled overnight after the archive ledger exposed decades of covert operations, political assassinations, illegal surveillance programs, and fabricated military threats designed to maintain wartime powers long after the actual enemies had faded.
Some citizens demanded complete revolution. Others demanded restoration of order at any cost. Nobody agreed on what came next.
But everyone agreed on one thing: Jason Kane had not been the villain they were promised. Elena barely left his side during those days except when doctors forced her to sleep for a few hours at a time. Even then she rarely managed real rest. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the spillway bridge collapsing beneath him again. She sat beside his hospital bed late one evening while rain tapped softly against the window overlooking the capital skyline.
The city beyond looked different now.
Fires from earlier riots had faded, but military drones still patrolled the skies while emergency broadcasts flickered across distant towers.
Jason finally woke more fully sometime after midnight.
He stared at the ceiling silently for several moments before turning his head toward Elena. "You're still here." Her eyes lifted immediately from the chair beside him.
"You sound disappointed." "No," he answered honestly.
"Just surprised." She leaned back slightly. "You've survived explosions, prison, torture, political conspiracies, and a collapsing dam." Her voice softened. "But apparently me sitting in a chair remains shocking."
A faint smile appeared at the corner of Jason's mouth before pain quickly replaced it. Elena noticed instantly. "Don't move too much." "I wasn't planning an escape."
"Good. Because your body currently resembles broken architecture." Jason looked down at the bandages covering his chest and shoulder.
"That bad? One doctor described you as medically unreasonable." He gave a weak laugh that turned into coughing. Elena immediately handed him water.
He drank slowly before settling back against the pillows again. Silence filled the room comfortably for a while.
Not empty silence this time. Something calmer. Worn but real.
Eventually Jason glanced toward the television mounted silently in the corner. News footage showed senators being escorted into federal custody while crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding resignations.
"How bad is it?" he asked quietly. Elena followed his gaze. "Depends who you ask." She stood and muted the television completely. The eastern provinces declared temporary autonomy this morning.
Several military commanders resigned.
Financial markets crashed.
Jason closed his eyes briefly.
"And the civilians?" Elena hesitated. "Confused. Angry. Scared."
She sat beside him again.
"But alive." Jason nodded once.
"For him that mattered most." Elena studied him carefully for a moment before speaking again.
"Voss survived surgery." Jason's expression barely changed. "I figured. He's being transferred to an international tribunal next week. He'll talk." Elena looked surprised. You think so? Jason stared quietly toward the rain outside.
Men like Voss always believe history might still forgive them if they explain themselves long enough.
Elena considered that, then asked the question lingering beneath everything else. And you?
Jason turned toward her slowly.
What about me? What happens to you now?
The truth was neither of them knew.
Officially his conviction remained active pending full review by the new provisional government.
Half the country wanted him pardoned immediately. The other half considered him responsible for destabilizing the Republic regardless of his motives.
Jason himself seemed strangely unconcerned about either side.
I never really planned past surviving the week, he admitted quietly.
Elena's eyes softened with sadness. That's a terrible way to live. I know. Another silence settled between them before Jason spoke again, more quietly this time. I'm sorry. Elena frowned slightly. For what? For disappearing.
His voice carried no defensiveness now.
Only exhaustion and honesty. For letting.
You believe the worst version of me because I thought it would protect you.
Elena looked down at her hands for several long seconds. Do you know what hurt most? She asked finally.
Jason listened carefully.
Not thinking you betrayed us.
She swallowed hard.
It was believing that maybe I never really knew you at all. The words hit harder than accusation ever could. Jason stared at the blankets over his lap. I wanted you to hate me, he admitted. Hate survives easier than grief.
Elena shook her head slowly. You don't get to decide how people carry pain for them.
Jason met her eyes again. I know that now.
She studied him quietly. The man in the hospital bed looked nothing like the invincible commander from old recruitment posters. Time and suffering had carved too many scars into him for that. But for the first time in years she could actually see him clearly again.
Not the myth. Not the traitor. Just Jason. Tired. Human.
Still trying to save everyone even after the world buried him alive.
Elena reached forward and took his hand carefully. You don't have to disappear anymore.
Emotion flickered across Jason's face so briefly that most people would have missed it.
Elena did not.
Before either could say more, the hospital door opened and Marcus stepped inside carrying several folders beneath one arm. He looked exhausted too, though cleaner now in a fresh intelligence uniform missing all official insignia. The government agencies he once served barely existed anymore. You're awake, Marcus said, relief crossing his face.
Jason nodded slightly. Still unfortunately alive.
Marcus pulled a chair closer to the bed.
That's becoming your signature. He handed Elena one of the folders before sitting down heavily. Provisional Council released the preliminary findings. Jason raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds ominous. Marcus laughed without humor. It's catastrophic. He opened the top file revealing pages of names and classified operation reports.
The ledger implicated over 400 officials across 12 countries.
Some already fled. Others are negotiating immunity deals. Jason studied the documents quietly. And the Republic? Marcus leaned back wearily.
Depends what survives the next few months. He rubbed his face tiredly. Several border states are mobilizing forces.
Civilian protests turned violent in the western districts yesterday. Elena looked uneasy. Is it becoming civil war? Marcus hesitated too long before answering. Not yet. Jason understood immediately. But it could. Marcus nodded. That's why I came.
He reached into another folder and removed a sealed document.
The Provisional Council wants to meet you. Elena frowned. Why? Marcus gave Jason a look filled with equal parts disbelief and irony.
Because half the country trusts him more than the government right now.
Jason looked genuinely disturbed by that idea. That's a terrible sign. Probably. Marcus handed over the document anyway. They want your help stabilizing the transition. Jason stared at the papers without touching them. No, Marcus blinked. You haven't even read it. Don't need to.
Jason shifted painfully against the pillows.
I'm not leading anything. Marcus looked frustrated. Jason, people are listening to you now.
That's exactly why I shouldn't.
Elena watched him carefully. You really mean that?
Jason looked toward the darkened window again where rain streaked down the glass like blurred ghosts.
Power changes people.
His voice remained quiet but certain.
Even people who think they're immune.
Marcus shook his head.
You're not Voss.
No, Jason agreed.
But neither was he once.
The room fell silent again.
None of them could easily argue with that.
Later that night after Marcus left, Elena found Jason sitting carefully beside the hospital window despite explicit medical instructions not to leave the
bed.
She crossed her arms immediately.
You realize doctors hate you for this. Jason looked out across the sleeping city. Doctors have hated me for years. Elena walked beside him. You shouldn't be standing. Probably.
She noticed the way he watched the skyline.
What are you thinking about? Jason remained silent for several seconds.
Port Aldder.
Elena's expression softened immediately.
He rarely mentioned it directly.
What about it? Jason leaned one hand against the glass.
Sometimes I still hear the wall collapse when everything gets quiet. His voice carried no dramatics. Just truth. All those soldiers trapped inside the sector.
The civilians in the tunnels. Elena moved closer beside him. You saved who you could. Not enough. There was never going to be an enough.
Jason closed his eyes briefly.
That's the part people never understand about war.
He looked exhausted suddenly in a way sleep alone could never repair.
The medals come later. The guilt arrives immediately.
Elena rested her head gently against his shoulder despite all the bandages and bruises. Then maybe it's time somebody helped carry it with you.
Jason looked down at her quietly. You already did once. Not like this.
She met his eyes directly.
Not honestly.
Somewhere far below the hospital windows, sirens echoed faintly through the city streets while helicopters crossed the skyline beneath heavy clouds. The Republic remained unstable.
Dangerous. Uncertain.
But for the first time in years Jason did not feel completely alone inside it.
2 weeks later the trial resumed.
Only now everything had changed.
The same courthouse that once demanded Jason Kane's execution now stood surrounded by crowds carrying signs reading "Hero and Tell the Truth."
Protesters still argued outside the security barriers, but the hatred no longer felt absolute.
Confusion had replaced certainty. Debate replaced blind outrage.
Inside the tribunal chamber, repaired after the attack, reporters packed every seat while international observers filled the upper galleries.
Jason entered wearing a dark formal suit instead of prison restraints.
The room fell silent immediately when he appeared.
Elena walked beside him this time.
Marcus followed close